In 1987, in the middle of Brazil, something that looked almost harmless began to circulate through a city. It wasn't loud, it didn't explode, and it didn't arrive with warning signs or uniforms. It appeared as a strange blue light, admired for its beauty, broken apart, shared, and carried home as if it were just another curious object taken from the ruins of an abandoned building. Over the following days, people began to fall ill without understanding why. Hospitals received patients with symptoms that didn't seem to belong together. Doctors compared notes, searched for explanations, and found none that fully made sense. Meanwhile, the source of the problem kept moving quietly through neighborhoods, scrapyards, buses, and houses. Only later would the questions start to take shape. How did something this dangerous pass through so many hands unnoticed? Why was it treated as scrap instead of a threat? And at what point did a simple act of salvage turn into a national emergency? What started small became the most serious nuclear accident in Brazilian history. And the moment when everything finally made sense did not come at the beginning. It came later. Stay until the end to understand how this happened, how an invisible danger spread through an ordinary city, and how a series of small decisions, delays, and misunderstandings allowed a quiet blue glow to turn into a national disaster. In the mid-1980s, Goiânia was a growing city, distant from Brazil's industrial and political centers, confident in its own pace. Life moved around construction sites, small businesses, hospitals, bus routes, and neighborhoods, expanding faster than regulations could always keep up. It was a place where things were reused, repaired, adapted. What broke was rarely thrown away immediately. It was sold, salvaged, stripped for parts. Years earlier, a private radiotherapy clinic had operated in the city center. When the clinic moved to a new location, the old building was left behind in a legal and administrative limbo. Ownership disputes dragged on. Responsibility became unclear. The equipment stayed where it was, locked inside a decaying structure that no longer belonged, in practice, to anyone who felt accountable for it. Time did what it always does in abandoned places. Doors were forced, walls were damaged. The building slowly became part of the urban background. Another ruin among many, unnoticed by most people who passed it every day. Inside, the radiotherapy machine remained intact, heavy, technical, and completely out of context, like a piece of advanced medicine stranded in the wrong decade and the wrong neighborhood. To someone trained, it was a controlled source of radiation. To someone else, it was just metal. In September of 1987, two men entered the abandoned clinic looking for scrap. This was not unusual. Scrap meant money, even if only a little. Copper, steel, anything that could be sold by weight. They found a large machine, partially dismantled, clearly valuable in material terms, and difficult to move. They did what countless others would have done in the same situation. They took it apart. There were no warning signs that made sense to them. No alarms, no heat, no smell. Nothing that suggested danger. The object didn't resist. It didn't react. It simply came apart, piece by piece. As machines do, what they removed was taken to a scrapyard, a place where objects begin their second life. There, the machine was examined not as medical equipment, but as potential income. Parts were separated, metal was weighed. Components were handled, touched, inspected closely. At some point, attention shifted from the bulk of the material to something smaller, heavier than expected, sealed inside. When it was finally opened, what appeared did not resemble anything threatening. It glowed, a soft blue light, visible in the dark. Unlike fire, unlike electricity, unlike anything most people had seen before. It didn't burn. It didn't shock. It didn't hurt. It simply shone. And in that moment, nothing about it suggested urgency. To the people standing there, it was not the beginning of a disaster. It was a curiosity, a mystery, something almost beautiful, something worth showing to others. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with fear, not with alarms, but with ordinary people in an ordinary city, encountering something they had no reason to recognize as dangerous. From here on, every step makes sense, until it doesn't. Once the machine was reduced to parts, it stopped being a single object and became something else entirely. It became fragments, pieces with different owners, different destinations, different meanings. What had once been confined to one abandoned room began to move, quietly and efficiently, through the informal economy of the city. The scrapyard was not a place of alarm. It was a place of routine. People came and went. Buyers negotiated prices. Metal was weighed, sorted, and resold. The small sealed capsule that produced the blue glow did not raise suspicion. On the contrary, it drew attention. In a business built on the ordinary, it was something new. The glow was strongest in the dark. At night, when the yard emptied and the city slowed down, it became more visible. People gathered around it. Some held it in their hands. Others broke pieces off. The material inside was powdery, crystalline, almost luminous. It clung to skin. It stuck to clothes. It spread without effort, carried on fingertips, shoes, pockets. There was no reason to be cautious. Nothing in everyday experience suggested danger. Radiation had no place in the mental map of a scrapyard, or a neighborhood, or a family home. It belonged to distant power plants, to science fiction, to things that happened somewhere else. So the glow traveled. Small amounts were taken home, shown to relatives, passed to friends. Children played with it. Adults kept it as a curiosity. Some rubbed it on their skin, fascinated by the way it shone. The substance entered houses, buses, kitchens, bedrooms, moving along the same social paths as gossip, favors, and small exchanges. At the same time, something else began to circulate, more slowly and far less visibly. People started feeling unwell. At first, the symptoms were ordinary enough to be ignored: nausea, fatigue, headaches, skin irritation, things that could be blamed on food and stress, the heat. In a growing city, people were used to discomfort. Life didn't stop for minor illness. But the pattern didn't stay isolated. Different families, in different neighborhoods, began showing similar signs. Children became sick at the same time adults did. Pets fell ill. Some symptoms worsened quickly. Others lingered without explanation. Clinics and hospitals saw patients who didn't know how to describe what they were feeling, only that something was wrong. Doctors treated what they could see: dehydration, infections, allergic reactions. There was no obvious link between these cases, no shared address, no common event that pointed to a single cause. Each patient appeared, on paper, to be an individual problem. Meanwhile, the blue glow continued to move. What made this phase so decisive was not ignorance, but plausibility. Every decision still made sense within the information people had. Objects were reused because they always had been. Illness was treated as illness usually was. No one was hiding anything. No one believed they were taking risks. The disaster did not advance through panic. It advanced through normal life. And by the time the first alarms began to sound, the substance had already traveled far beyond the place where it was first discovered, embedded not just in objects, but in routines, relationships, and homes. The city was already contaminated. It just didn't know it yet. By the time the first serious alarms were raised, the city was already dealing with something it could no longer explain as coincidence. Hospitals began to notice that certain patients were not improving. Skin lesions worsened instead of healing. Vomiting persisted. Hair loss appeared in cases where it made no sense. Doctors compared notes informally, trying to understand why people from different parts of the city were showing symptoms that seemed related but had no obvious cause. What finally broke the pattern of uncertainty was not a single diagnosis, but suspicion. One physician began to consider the possibility of radiation exposure, an idea that initially sounded implausible. Goiânia was not home to nuclear plants or research reactors. There was no known industrial accident, no official alert. Radiation, like many invisible dangers, belonged to somewhere else. Still, the symptoms kept pointing in that direction. Samples were taken. Tests were requested. As word reached state and federal authorities, the response shifted from routine healthcare to investigation. Specialists were contacted. Equipment was brought in. For the first time, people arrived carrying devices designed not to heal, but to detect. When radiation detectors were turned on, the city revealed something no one had been able to see before. Readings spiked in places that should have been ordinary. Houses, buses, yards. Objects that had been handled casually now triggered alarms. The pattern was no longer random. It followed the same paths the glowing material had taken days earlier. At this point, the problem could no longer be contained quietly. Areas were isolated, homes were evacuated, entire families were told to leave with only what they were wearing. Possessions that had defined daily life, furniture, clothes, photographs, toys, were suddenly treated as hazardous waste. What could not be cleaned was removed. What could not be removed was destroyed. News spread quickly, but unevenly. Some residents understood that something serious was happening. Others only saw confusion, officials in protective gear, streets blocked without clear explanation. Rumors filled the gaps where information had not yet arrived. Fear followed uncertainty. As federal teams took control, the scale of the accident became clearer. What had begun as a single abandoned machine had turned into dozens of contaminated sites across the city. Thousands of people needed screening. Hundreds required medical follow-up. A smaller number were already critically ill. For the authorities involved, this was uncharted territory. Brazil had emergency protocols for floods, fires, epidemics. It did not have experience dealing with a radioactive substance spreading through an urban population outside any nuclear facility. Decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information, balancing public safety against panic, urgency against precision. Containment became the priority. But containment, by definition, meant acknowledging what had happened, and once the invisible danger was finally named, the city of Goiânia entered a phase that would permanently change how the accident was remembered, not as a mystery, but as a national trauma unfolding in real time. The glow was no longer a curiosity. It was evidence, and now everyone could see it. Once the danger was identified, Goiânia changed its rhythm almost overnight. Teams in protective suits moved through neighborhoods marking houses, sealing rooms, collecting objects that days earlier had seemed ordinary. Streets were blocked. Trucks carried away furniture, clothes, appliances, sometimes entire sections of homes. What could be cleaned was scrubbed again and again. What could not was removed without ceremony. People stood outside watching their lives being dismantled. For those directly affected, the problem was no longer abstract. Some were hospitalized under isolation. Others were told to report daily for monitoring. Families were separated. Parents were kept from children. Visitors were restricted. The logic was medical, but the experience was deeply personal. As the cleanup expanded, another effect began to spread alongside it: fear. Rumors traveled faster than official explanations. Businesses associated with contaminated areas lost customers overnight. Entire neighborhoods were avoided. Buses were abandoned when passengers realized who was on board. People from Goiânia were treated with suspicion in other cities, as if radiation were contagious in the simplest sense. Some were refused service. Others were turned away, quietly. Many stopped saying where they were from. At the same time, authorities faced decisions that carried no easy answers. How much contamination was acceptable? What could be salvaged? How to compensate families for losses that could not be neatly calculated? How to communicate risk without creating panic? The cleanup itself became one of the largest operations of its kind. Contaminated material was transported to specially prepared sites outside the city. Thousands of tons of waste were isolated and buried. Monitoring would continue not for weeks or months, but for years. Medical teams followed exposed individuals closely, documenting symptoms, progression, recovery, and, in some cases, decline. Some patients improved, others did not. The effects of radiation did not respect schedules or expectations. It unfolded at its own pace. For the broader public, the accident became a national spectacle and a local wound. Television cameras arrived. Officials gave statements. Numbers were reported and revised. The story was retold again and again, often simplified, sometimes distorted. What had begun as a series of small, understandable actions was now framed as a catastrophe with clear borders, even though those borders had never truly existed. Inside the city, daily life tried to resume. Schools reopened, shops unlocked their doors, streets filled again. But the sense of normality was fragile. People had learned, abruptly, that danger did not always announce itself, and that trust in routine could be misplaced. Goiânia was no longer just a growing city in central Brazil. It had become a place marked by an invisible event, one that could not be seen anymore, but could not be forgotten either. And while the immediate crisis slowly moved toward resolution, another question remained unresolved, hanging quietly over everything that followed. What would remain after the cleanup was finished? The answer would not be measured in radiation levels. It would be measured in memory. When the emergency phase ended, the city was left with something harder to define than contamination. Radiation levels dropped. Restricted areas were reduced. Monitoring became routine. Life, at least on the surface, moved forward. But what had happened could not be folded neatly into a report and filed away. It stayed present in medical records, in legal disputes, in neighborhoods that never quite regained their former shape. Some of those exposed recovered fully. Others lived with long-term health effects that would only become clear years later. A few did not survive. Their stories entered official counts, then drifted into statistics, even as families continued to live with their absence in ordinary, daily ways. The abandoned clinic was no longer just an abandoned building. It became a reference point in how risk is managed and mismanaged when responsibility dissolves between institutions. Laws were revised, regulations tightened. Brazil's approach to radioactive sources changed permanently, shaped not by theory, but by experience. Goiânia itself became a case study, taught far beyond its borders. Emergency planners, health authorities, and international agencies returned to it again and again, not because it was unique, but because it was plausible. The accident did not depend on rare technology or extreme conditions. It depended on neglect, delay, and the assumption that danger announces itself clearly. For the people who lived through it, memory took quieter forms. Some avoided certain streets without consciously knowing why. Others kept telling the story, refining it, correcting it, insisting on details that refused to fade. A blue glow that had once seemed beautiful became something no one wanted to see again, even in recollection. What made the accident enduring was not its scale alone, but its lesson. The most dangerous moment was not when authorities arrived in protective gear. It was not when alarms finally sounded. It was the long stretch of time before that, when everything still felt normal, reasonable, explainable. That is where the story truly sits, in a junkyard, in an abandoned building, in hands that had no reason to hesitate. The glow did not look like a warning. It did not behave like a threat. And because of that, it was allowed to move freely, quietly, until it reshaped an entire city. By the time Goiânia understood what it had been holding, the glow was gone. What remained was knowledge, paid for in ways no city ever intends to pay. And a reminder that some disasters begin not with force, but with familiarity. And once they do, they are very hard to stop. If this story stayed with you, there are many others like it. Moments when ordinary decisions quietly reshaped entire societies. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we revisit the parts of history that only make sense when you look closely enough. The past rarely announces its dangers. That's why it's worth remembering how they begin.